The Oneida boarding school actually started in 1893, and the big push behind it were some tribal leaders, but also the priest Burleson uh, was instrumental in not only getting the boarding school at that time, but simultaneously building the hospital at near the Holy Apostles Church, and in a dispensary or over at the boarding school as well. So I think there was um, a deal cut that they would have a boarding school, which is unique, a boarding school on the reservation, not off the reservation. It was on the reservation so that students, children of Oneida parents, could go to the boarding school. It was placed in near the Oneida train station, um, and it was built. The building itself was built of bricks, and there were laborers that were employed along with the people who designed the buildings and who were engineers and that kind of thing. It was unique again because the buildings were quite well built, and they had electricity in them. They had heat in them that was generated from a plant in the rear of the building, um, going down the hill in back of the village. And so they burned wood to get the heat, and they had pipes in there, and they had a water tower to supply water to the building. So those were modern conveniences for the boarding school that none of the Oneida families had access to, because all the Oneida families, well, they burned wood for heat and cooking too, but they had oil lamps for heat, or they had oil lamps for light rather, and they didn't have any plumbing in their homes, and many of them still had log homes at that time to live in. Some had frame houses, but most of them had log homes. There were the Oneida boarding school was designed for about 200 to accommodate 200 students, and they did. And they had students who were all the way from 5 years old, probably up to their late teens, and even up to 20. The school was designed like other boarding schools, where half a day would be for academics, for the basics, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and some other studies. And the other half of the day would be devoted to actually work, but the students would be learning something at the same time. They would be learning dairying or making products from milk, like butter and cheese. The girls would be learning how to bake and make all kinds of other things like donuts for the whole school, for all of the students and all of the staff who were teaching there. The girls did that. The girls also cut and sewed all the uniforms for all of the students. The little girls, as well as the older girls, as well as the military uniforms for the boys. The girls were taught how to do that. We have one picture of a group of students, very young, 5, 6, 7 years old, who are in boys with lace collars on their uniforms, learning how to darn socks. So everybody was designed, everybody was taught to be a utility in the boarding school. They all had to do something to be productive. So here were the little boys, 6 years old, learning how to darn socks. When the girls were a little older, not much older, 10, 11, 12, they would be working in the kitchen and learning that, or working in the laundry, where they had to do all of the bedding, wash all of the bedding, do all of the ironing with flat irons, which were big, heavy irons that they heated up on the stove somewhere, and then they kept exchanging them when they got cool. They'd exchange it for another hot iron, and the girls did that. So they had long days. They got up quite early, and usually they marched to school. In some of the other boarding schools, there was always a band, and the band played the music which accompanied the students to march. And they would march on the field in drill for practice, but they would march from their dormitories to the dining hall also, every day. And usually they didn't march on Sundays. That's probably the only day that they didn't march somewhere. The Oneida boarding school had an epidemic of smallpox in 1905. And those documents are available to look at. You have to research down at the archives in Chicago, at the regional archives. They have not been put on microfilm or microfiche. They are in the original documents. And the ones that I read said that the superintendent was frantic and writing all over to get help, doctors to come in and help with those who were sick with smallpox. I didn't read all the documents, but I suspect there were several deaths and other things that happened. They could have had other diseases as well at the same time. Someone needs to do that. Someone needs to go to Chicago and spend an amount of time to research all the documents for the Oneida boarding school. Joseph C. Hart was the superintendent for an extended period of time, from Mr. Pearson, I think, to 1919. He was in charge of the school, as well as he was the Indian agent when the land was, the allotments were sold, I guess, when the allotments were either sold or taken. And Mr. Hart was in charge of that, of the school and of the agency itself.
So when was the first building built for the boarding school, and how long was the boarding school in existence?
Well, the first buildings, I think it was finished in 1893. But there was one of the buildings that was burned completely, got on fire, and was rebuilt in a couple of years before 1900. So the school buildings were there in existence until 1954 or 1953 or 1954, because the school was closed in 1919. It was a big controversy because the Oneidas wanted the school to stay open, and if it didn't stay open, they wanted the school for other programs, other economic development programs. None of that happened. And the school was sold to the Green Bay Diocese, Catholic Diocese, in 1924 for the exact appraised value of the school. That was wrong because the BIA regulations required that there should be at least 3 bids for the school property, and that whoever had the highest bid would get the sale and the property. That did not happen. There was a dummy land company set up in Green Bay, which was a front for the Catholic Diocese, and they purchased the school property, the 80 acres plus 118 acres that was purchased earlier from George Dockstader to add to the farming program there. The dummy land company purchased all of that for the exact appraised value, which was $24,000 plus dollars. A bargain. Very cheap. And the diocese then utilized all the buildings, upgraded some of them, and utilized all the buildings that existed for the Guardian Angel boarding school. There were no tribal folks there. I think there may have been 2 Oneida students in that boarding school. One of them was Betty Binns. I don't recall who the other one was right now, but those are the only Oneida students who went there. Otherwise, they were kids that were utilized, who were serviced by the diocese, and they were orphans, or they were students whose parents were not able to take care of their children, or even abandoned children, that kind of thing. And those were the students who attended the Guardian Angel boarding school.
And what year was that in?
That was from 1924 to, well, about 30 years, till 1954.
You mentioned the BIA. What kind of involvement did they have in the development of the boarding school, if any?
Well, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was the final approval on everything that happened there. There were reports that were sent to the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. The whole regime of boarding schools started in 1878, I believe, with Carlisle being the first school, one of the first. Hampton, which was the other one on Chesapeake Bay, was also initiated about the same time. They were run by military men, captains or majors or something like that. So they were a military type school with the regiment, with the military uniforms and the regiment of marching, and learning those kinds of things that were a military style, which was very remote from the way that Indian students learned, and they had their own, Indian tribes had their own culture, which was servicing them very well until it was upset by immigration of people from Europe. And so they had to change, everything went upside down in terms of the boarding schools at that time.
What was the main reason for the closing of the boarding school, the Oneida boarding school?
The Bureau of Indian Affairs was interested in closing the boarding school for starting in 1911. And actually, it was quite a hassle between the Bureau and the Oneida people because the Oneida people wanted the school. I think part of it was because the students there would get a regular 3 meals a day. They would have a warm place in the wintertime. And at the same time, they were learning things that the people at home had their own way of learning, and they were doing fine, but the students were learning how to get along in the larger civilized world, I guess. That's what that was all about, was attempting to teach Indian students to get along with their non-Indian neighbors and to learn about their non-Indian neighbors and how to get along in that world.
Okay. With the boarding schools and the buildings that were built, how many buildings encompass the whole boarding school?
I think there may have been about 15 altogether if you counted this one here. That's the campus. If you counted all of the buildings where the students were attending, but then there were auxiliary buildings out on the outside, which were the farming buildings and the hospital and things like that besides the regular school buildings. So there were I would say there were about 15 buildings altogether.
And what happened to those buildings? Other than being tore down, but they didn't all be erected at the same time. They weren't tore down at the same time. What happened to those buildings?
When they decided, when the diocese decided to do what do they call it, training for young priests school, and when they decided to do that, they had to have an architect and design a new building. And so when they did that and accepted it, then they built a new building right around the old buildings before they took them down. And we have photographs of that where they didn't. Oh, here, this is one right here, where some of the original buildings are still standing. Here's one here, the little girl's dorm. Here's the dining hall. It's still standing, the roof is off, but they are building the Norbert Hill Center right around the old buildings.
And the Norbert Hill building is current times. At that time, it was known as what?
It was, now that's what I was trying to think of.
Sacred Heart?
It was a Sacred Heart, Sacred Heart Seminary. That's why they call it Seminary Road, I guess. Yeah, so Sacred Heart Seminary for young men to attend to become priest. And that's what it was at that time. And then Pope John the 23rd had a different agenda, and the rules were relaxed, and the Sacred Heart Seminary did not have as many participants, as many students as in previous years, and so the building was not utilized fully. And then there were a priest, Father David Kiefer, and Sister Tony were attempting to put programs that were paying programs in the facility, after the seminary closed, and that was not economical. It was not efficient, and so it cost quite a bit of money to maintain those buildings. And eventually, the Oneida tribe purchased the property. The appraised value was $1.35 million, and the Oneida Nation purchased it for $800,000. And at the original time when it was transferred in April of 1984, the tribe paid $400,000 and then later paid the balance on it. The diocese transferred 91 acres of that farmland because the reason it wasn't 118 acres like the original transfer land was because the highway 54 going around the village took a lot of the land that was utilized for farming, and so it ended up with 91 acres there, adjoining the 80 acres. And the diocese in 1984 transferred that land, transferred the property, including the improvements, to the tribe and without cost for the land, only for cost of the improvements, which was 800. It ended up being 800,000, which that ended up being a bargain for the tribe too. But at the same time, the tribe has put millions of dollars of changes into the buildings in terms of new roof, asbestos abatement was a big thing because there was asbestos throughout the entire building, and windows, new windows, those kinds of things. But I think it's in excellent shape now, with the improvements that the tribe made also after purchase.